Excellent. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ioannis Lianos, and a great pleasure to welcome today a panel of excellent speakers to talk about a topic that is really in my heart. Ecosystem theories of harm have been a topic I've been working a lot also the last few years, and I think possibly a few years ago, if someone was thinking about a topic of a conference on ecosystems, that would have possibly not been easily somehow accepted, but this is something that now has become of importance for competition law and policy. So the concept of ecosystem has been developed in the 1990s, in particular by business studies literature, and has been slowly integrated into the competition law narrative. And I think it's quite interesting to think about the various reports that came up in the 2015, 16, and later, the Furman report, the Stigler report, or the Heike-Schweizer report, which were focusing on digital platforms. And I think most recently we have seen a shift from a narrative of digital platforms to the narrative of ecosystems, which I think is quite interesting from that perspective in terms of the focus of the analysis. Now, what is an ecosystem? And I think it's possibly something that speakers will be discussing later this afternoon. We have actually quite enormous recent business literature which acknowledges that ecosystems are, quote, groups of firms that must deal with either unique or supermodular complementarities that are non-generic, requiring the creation of a specific structure of relationship and alignment to create value. I mean, that is a definition that possibly Michael will provide more context later. You have another definition by the former chief economist here, Regibo, basically discussing ecosystems as products that are subject to a set of rules by some owner, and because of these rules, the different products tend to be more attractive to be bought together rather than actually being bought by different sources. So the question of the definition of ecosystem, I think, is very important. And of course, the focus of competition law assessment on ecosystemic theories of harm, and in particular, competition between ecosystems, but also intra-ecosystem that can be of importance. Now, I think the concept has been slowly integrated into the competition law narrative. We have the recent draft market definition notice that has a specific section on digital, in brackets, ecosystems. And also there are quite important developments in the Google Android case about inter-ecosystemic competition. And of course, you know, we have been will be discussed today more thoroughly recent merger cases with ecosystemic theories of harm, and in particular be focusing on Booking Etraveli and Microsoft Activision. Now, so it's quite interesting, therefore, to ask what are the normative implications for competition law and policy as to the emergence and the rise, let's say, of ecosystemic theories of harm. Now, some traditionalists might think that all this is superfluous, and you know, why can we somehow stretch our existing contracts to encompass ecosystems? Why focus on ecosystems at all when we can redefine the concept of relevant market, for instance, and then leverage the existing analytical arsenal offered by competition analysis? So that could be somehow a traditionalist perspective. I think that, and I think as will be probably proven by the discussion today, there is an added value in the use of ecosystemic theories of harm. And in a way, I think that also it's quite important to have in mind various new somehow approaches concerning dynamic capabilities. Now, most recently, I would say some have focused narrowly on the dynamic capabilities of the digital platforms or the ecosystem orchestrator, but I think this is reductionist, and dynamic capabilities should be assessed also at the level of the ecosystem. So there could be restrictions imposed by the ecosystem orchestrator that can suppress the incentive and capabilities of the other members of the ecosystem to invest on R&D or increase their productivity, and to a certain extent, this could be an issue of concern for competition law and policy. So as a conclusion, I would say, and I will give the floor immediately to Cristina, who will make somehow an introduction to the concept of ecosystem, its use in the recent merger cases. You know, we might possibly disagree on the concept and the definition of the specific concept. However, I think it's quite important to take into account the fact that right now the various competitive interactions that take place do not only take place within specific relevant product markets, but take place at a more broader organizational level, that of ecosystems. And I think this is certainly something that should be of concern for competition authorities when they assess mergers as well as other activity, which could be other conduct, which could be anti-competitive. So let's give the floor to Cristina, that will make an introduction about the specific issue of ecosystems.
Thank you so much, Yanni, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be in this great panel. I will make my disclosures as I go along. I'm evidently an economist, so I'll be kind of trying to address the question of, at least set the scene. How have we got at this point to an ecosystem? Theory of harm particularly mergers. How did you get here? What does it look like? And it's fair to say, as Yanni alluded to, that ecosystems in mergers burst onto the scene very much recently with two very high-profile cases. I was the lead economist in Europe for Microsoft Activision, so that is a case that one can describe as perhaps a reversed prohibition. I'm sure the definition is not popular with many, but it's a prohibition that then is effectively, through various development, turned into an approval, and an actual prohibition, which is the Booking case. But it has been a long way kind of coming, right? Because one looks at the recent history, there have been cases in which the notion has been liminal, has been discussed in some way. I did Microsoft LinkedIn, and that was sort of in the background. There's been Meta Giphy, Meta Customer. These were not my cases, but again, the concept was somewhere there. There's been Amazon MGM. There was a discussion around those aspects. And indeed, Meta Within, which is a case I did in the US, where there was certainly a concern about an ecosystem. So, what is different from conglomerate theories? Because of course we've had conglomerate theories for forever in mergers. The main sort of difference is that in conglomerate theories in the past, we've essentially relied on some form of leveraging mechanism. The classic structure of these cases was one in which you had a market in which there is market power, and that power was being leveraged into another market that was the market of the target through some mechanism, could be time, could be bundling. So the discussion in those cases were very focused on these mechanisms. Are these credible? Are these feasible? Do they lead to foreclosure? And so you had the vertical arithmetic, you had various types of calibrated models and so on. But increasingly it has become clear that this is not enough as a story, because the starting point, which is staring us in the face, really, is that what really happens is firms are endowed with capabilities and assets. And these assets and capabilities are the sources of their respective relative success and advantage. And these assets and capabilities may be scarce and may be hard to come by, which is giving them the ability to construct and preserve a relative advantage. And this is not really captured in any meaningful way by measuring a relevant market and measuring a share in that relevant market. This is where the gap really exists. And there is a rich intellectual history, we'll hear from Michael and from Joost later, in the business literature to think about this in these terms, right? Assets and capabilities have long been discussed in that field, but we've been late to the party as IO economists and as practitioners in antitrust. And why are we getting there now? Because I think fundamentally the network of capabilities that we observe is changing, particularly in digital. So certainly the capabilities which markets value have been evolving in the last 20 years, making markets more interconnected than they were before. So again, when there's more interconnection, there's more synergies across markets, there's more benefit from having a network. So capabilities that weren't valued before have become valuable. Imagine algorithm that helps you identify a shape or translate words into script. that wasn't really so valuable 20 years ago. It is now absolutely central. Another thing happened is markets have emerged that we haven't seen before. And so these capabilities are now much more integrated, much more relevant as a support for a number of these activities. Markets are more interconnected. So briefly, what we have seen in Microsoft, Activision, and in Booking is an effort by agencies to ask the question, well, what do we make of this? How do we actually articulate a concern around this concept? Is there a problem when there are multiple assets and capabilities that exist and are brought together by a target which is being plonked in this network, even if there is no suggestion that there's going to be time or bundling in the future? This is the critical difference. And so the cases were different. We'll talk about them in a moment, but of course Microsoft was about whether the assets and the capabilities that Microsoft possessed, cloud, operating system, and hardware and data, and a portfolio of games, could be giving it an advantage in an incipient new market like cloud gaming. That was the theory. In Booking, the story is different. The question is whether the acquisition would ultimately preserve the moat around an incumbent player, help through this acquisition to reinforce that dominance. But essentially, the question is, how do we articulate this theory, and what is a way in which both as economists and practitioners we can discriminate between things that are benign and things that are less so? Because of course there are limiting principles that one needs to bear in mind. Not every merger of assets in this type is remotely problematic. There are situations in which the deal can bring forward new products, services, and can be certainly benign. So how do we actually discriminate between a situation in which you've got stuff and you're plonking this other asset into your stuff, and that's good, and where it is a problem? And frankly, that's where the work needs to be done by economists, because there isn't an awful lot there. The management business school has done a lot more work, but not the IO crowd. And this is something which I'm sort of pushing people to do. Let me leave it there.
Thank you very much, Cristina. I think it's quite interesting the point you made about this idea of the ecosystem being the glue of different capabilities and assets, without necessarily needing to have some kind of contact like time that makes something at the competitive. I think it's quite important for competition analysis to have this in mind, this idea of something which is not related to conduct, but is a form of actually glue, creating value, of course, between the orchestrator and the various complementors, that somehow provides an advantage, a competitive advantage to which it could be significant and can lead to abnormal profits. I will now turn to Sir Marcus, who will come next. Take a little bit of the legal perspective, and I would like to ask you, what do you think justifies the shift to an ecosystem analysis in competition law, and what does and should it look like?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. Let me begin with a self-limiting warning that I'm not going to speak about Microsoft Activision. My role there was confined to hearing the longest adjournment application in legal history, nor am I going to try and discuss any of the pending cases. But I am going to major on the one decision which I think is significant in terms of ecosystems, which is the Meta and Giphy merger, because I'm going to equate, a little boldly perhaps, dynamic competition with business ecosystems. And my proposition is really that dynamic competition is looking at the future in terms of what a present understanding of the present ecosystem is going to deliver in the future. Now, it's trite that our approach to mergers has been, until the Meta and Giphy merger, somewhat one-dimensional. Being a little oversimplistic, but not very, we've looked at market share, either as it is at the time of the merger, or as it might be in the future by a process of extrapolation. And we could call it, as some do, a foreclosure analysis, but the fact is it is very much a market share-based approach. The CAT's decision in Meta against the CMA, upholding the CMA's decision to refuse the Meta-Giphy merger on grounds of dynamic competition analysis, has opened, I fear, a whole world of problems which can be encapsulated really in a single sentence. Where do I buy a reliable crystal ball? The problem for both the competition authority and any reviewing court, and I think this will be a problem for the reviewing court, whatever the standard of review, whether it's JR or the merits, the problem is that the competition authority, to start with the authority, will be identifying multiple alternative possible futures, divorced from market share, and trying to work out from the present business dynamic or ecosystem whether the bad possible futures outweigh the good. And any reviewing court is going to be faced with the unpalatable choice between trying to apply objective standards of rationality to what is fundamentally an exercise in guesswork, hopefully educated, or in simply affirming the underlying decision. Now, of course, courts do deal with uncertainty all the time. If I'm assessing a claimant's personal injury damages, the length of that person's life will not be known, and we will assess it. Loss of a chance is a feature in all litigation, and anyone who's read any judgment emanating out of the CAT will have seen ample reference to the broad brush and to econometric analysis and all of these uncertainties. But I do consider that the dynamic competition or ecosystem analysis involves a series of far harder questions of predictability than these ordinary ones. The question of whether, for example, a small entity with a sound business proposition and an adventuresome position in the market is going to be commercially vast or hugely significant is, in my judgment, a level of uncertainty of a different order, because markets are inherently not predictable. I remember reading a commission decision ages ago all about the games console market, and there they said, oh, you know, we are very concerned that Atari is going to be dominating the market for the next 30 or 40 years. Now, Atari, have you heard of it? I mean, it's gone, it's dead. Kodak, who thought that would go? Blockbuster. The whole point about market economies is creative destruction, and predicting what is going to be creatively destroyed in the future or created in the future is a very difficult proposition. And I venture to suggest that anyone who can get this right is not going to be in competition law or regulation. They're going to be making a fortune in the market. So the only reason this level of uncertainty didn't derail the Meta and Giphy JR is because of the sheer boldness and novelty of the CMA's approach, which meant that the challenge from Meta in that case came at the level of a general principle, very much you can't do this, rather than from a specific rationality challenge, which would be explain on objective grounds why the future is bad if the merger is allowed. So in that case, we ducked a bullet. But next time it's going to be different, because the attack, I think, is going to be different. So the shift to dynamic competition or ecosystem analysis has probably been triggered by the techno market. And clearly, competition lawyers are going to have to do, indeed already are, some recalibrating. What we're seeing is perhaps best exemplified by Amazon, which has moved from being a competitor in the books market to a market platform in its own right, acting as the market for the provision of many, many goods. And the response of a competition law to an alternative provider of books is obviously going to be different, where actually the provider of books controls large parts of the market for many products across many geographies. Amazon, if you like, is its own ecosystem, and that is what we are perhaps seeing with digital markets these days. Amazon, of course, is a case of organic growth, not merger. And here we come to another variant on the crystal ball theme. Obviously, if Megna Technocorp acquires a far smaller company to kill off a rival, that should be prohibited. But what if, and this was the Giphy case, Mega Technocorp seeks to acquire a far smaller company in order to improve its own offering? And what if, and this was also the Giphy case, the far smaller company actually wants to be acquired by someone like Mega Technocorp? immediately we see the critical importance of grounding any merger decision in rationality, meaning that the reason for the decision needs to be explained and justified to the reasonably interested passenger on the Clapham omnibus. And the shift to an ecosystem analysis has, I would suggest, been forced upon us, and we are now forced to work out what we mean by an ecosystem analysis and what factors are relevant and what factors are irrelevant in making our merger decisions. So let's try to understand what it is we are talking about, starting from first principles. Ronald Coase and others have pointed out that perfect competition does not actually explain why firms exist. Perfect competition explains how prices trend to cost, where markets are perfectly contestable, and each firm is faced with an individually perfectly elastic demand curve. Now, a world of perfect competition would make everyone's life so much easier. We wouldn't actually have any merger questions at all, and the joy of pass-on, which I'm grappling with in many cases, would actually cease to exist as a legal and conceptual headache. So for those reasons alone, bring on perfect competition. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist. And firms exist because enterprise requires them to exist. The world of perfect competition knows nothing of long-term investment, nothing of the patience of banks and shareholders, nothing of the long march to economic significance undertaken by my earlier Amazon example and many others. The kind of investment and trust that this takes requires the firm, by which I mean a corporation with legal personality of its own, the firm by operating its own ecosystem outside the market ecosystem, but its own. Other economists have referred less attractively to the firm as a gobbet of butter floating in a sea of milk, but you get my analogy. These things make complex economic development possible. Analytically speaking, considering the various factors of production, the firm, as it seems to me, is capital, not entrepreneurship or anything else. It is a tool for making products that the ultimate consumer buys, which is the textbook definition of capital. Limited liability, the ability to persist, to accumulate, legal personality, these are all powerful drivers, powerful advantages given to the firm. At the same time, through these powerful advantages, the firm ceases to be aligned with our own human interests and instincts. Maybe I am being hopelessly naive, but would the VW emissions scandal or the even worse post office tragedy and disgrace have occurred outside a corporate environment? If we think the answer might have been different with purely human actors, then perhaps there lies the clue by what we mean by an ecosystem. I'm postulating a link between the internal operation of the firm and the ecosystem of the firm and the external ecosystems of the market. In each case, we're talking about the dynamics of fluid institutions and markets. And so perhaps we need to reassess what factors actually matter in mergers if it is not predominantly market share. And I'll leave you with the following thoughts. First, to what extent has an ex post analysis enabled us to differentiate between successful and unsuccessful mergers? Should we try to identify a theory of mergers that seeks to explain why some mergers are consumer beneficial and some are not, and then apply these ex post analyses ex ante? If competition is valuable, my second thought, and perfect competition is in this regard a role model, doesn't any merger have to be justified by reference to some form of benefit test? The point about perfect competition is that it is merger hostile, and we ought to, I think, attach some weight to the notion that more competitors are better than fewer as a basic presumption. Where a merger involves loading debt on the acquired firm, an additional cost which will inevitably be passed on to the consumer, ought the merger to be prohibited on that ground alone? To what extent are we keen to avoid oligopoly, market shares come back? How dangerous are multiple common shareholdings in common ownership? There is some studies which suggest that common shareholdings in rivalrous enterprises is in itself a problem. And what do we do, to go back to digital platforms, what do we do if the ultimate consumer likes and in the short run benefits from the single platform? I'm reminded last night, sitting around the television, trying to get across the multiple platforms to which the Smith family subscribes, access to the one programme we wanted to watch. And I must say, we were thinking, just give us a bit of a good monopoly and we'd be somewhere home and dry. We'd at least be able to watch what we wanted to. What happens if our consumers actually want a monopoly? I obviously don't want a monopoly, but it would be very convenient last night. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir Marcus. This very interesting principle-based approach to the question. I think you raise a number of interesting issues. In particular, if we need to somehow link innovation, theories of harm, and ecosystems. I mean, this is really part of the same story, or ecosystem is a concept that could also be helpful for not necessarily innovation theories of harm. In a way, in many of these cases, I think internal documents have been quite helpful in building up a little bit the anti-competitive harm theory for innovation. But of course, we might hear much more about that, Mike Walker, in a moment. The second issue is, of course, how we can juxtapose the concept of firm vis-a-vis market and ecosystems. I mean, some might say that ecosystems are basically ensembles of independent firms that work together and align somehow their conduct to produce value for them as well as, of course, for the consumers. So is it ecosystem is a different concept, the supply chain, for instance, and how what is the added value of that concept from an analytical perspective? And of course, the issue of power. I mean, we, as competition lawyers, we're very much interested in the concept of power. And of course, you mentioned market shares as a possible metric for power that we use most often in a way as a proxy. But of course, is ecosystem power, ecosystemic power, something different than market power? And what are the types of evidence that we need to rely upon and metrics we need to rely upon in order to assess that ecosystemic power? And finally, the focus on consumers, which I think is very important. In a way, the ecosystemic theories of harm, to my view, but this is something obviously to be discussed, also bring in not just the final consumers, but also the complementors in a way. I mean, it could be also harmed, and consumers might directly be harmed at some point, but not necessarily. And this is something that we need to deal with, also with harm to complementors and complementors' ability to contribute to the competitive process through innovation, through R&D, through various types of possibilities and capabilities that they have. So let's move to now the competition authorities, and in particular Mike Walker. And my question is, what are you thinking about these theories, ecosystemic theories of harm at the CMA, especially post Microsoft Activision? Is still a form of foreclosure after all?
Okay, thank you. Standard caveat, I'm speaking on my own behalf, not on behalf of the CMA. I'm also not going to talk much about Microsoft Activision, partly because formally it's still under litigation, mostly because it's just not a controversial case. So, I'm also not significantly going to respond to what Marcus has said, although there's an awful lot an economist wants to say. So I might, if I get a chance at the end, I might, but I've only got my 6 minutes. So look, the starting point for thinking about ecosystems is they are often great for consumers, which of course what makes this whole thing hard. If ecosystems weren't often great for consumers, they're incredibly convenient, they interoperate seamlessly. Look at Apple, we all love Apple devices, they all work together, it's beautiful. If ecosystems weren't often fantastic for consumers, merger control would be really easy. If they're always bad, we'd just say no, fantastic. But the problem is, and Mark, someone said alluded to this, they're often good. How do you determine when they're good versus when they're bad? And because we can imagine a world in which competition between ecosystems could be particularly fierce. It's a bit like the corollary of competition between bundles is typically fiercer than competition between single product firms. You could absolutely imagine the same in the ecosystem world. And that is, of course, an argument that some members of GAFAM have tried to make. But of course, not all ecosystem mergers are the same way. They're not all bad, they're not all good. And so we have to have some sort of coherent strategy for trying to identify which are the bad mergers, which are the good mergers. So, I mean, I think the theories of harm are pretty heterogeneous, and I think it's quite difficult to say what is the ecosystem theory of harm. No, correction. You should not be saying what is the ecosystem theory of harm. It'll depend on the particular facts of the case. I think there are two broad concerns, because I was asked, is it still a form of foreclosure, how we think about these things at CMA? I mean, two broad concerns. One is entrenching of dominant positions, so that's obviously a particular concern in the Facebook or Meta Giphy merger. It's very hard to be relaxed about mergers that we think are going to lead to entrenchment of already very strong dominant positions that have been maintained over a significant period of time, particularly in a world in which remedying bad mergers is really difficult. You want an example of that? Just look at Google DoubleClick. I think probably the worst merger that's been allowed in my career. Undoing that is an absolute nightmare. Look at what they're trying to do in the States. Good luck to them. I mean, really, good luck to them. So we always want to maintain the possibility that dominant positions can be undermined by innovative new entrants. So that has, I think, to be a guiding light as to when some of these mergers might be bad. I mean, I think there is another concern about extending dominance into new or nascent markets. I think much more concern extending it into a nascent market. If it's just one firm moving into a market which is new to itself, there's already a bunch of competitors. Typically, I'm going to be a bit more relaxed about that. But certainly, when you have firms already very dominant in some areas, I'll come on to capabilities in a moment, moving into nascent markets, that can be a concern. Key thing here, I think, it's all about disruptive innovation and protecting the ability for disruptive innovators to be successful. So Marcus was, talked about perfect competition and said, I think he suggested it's not always a great paradigm for this area. Absolutely, it's not a great paradigm for this area. Perfect competition is not an area of disruptive innovation. I mean, the nature of homogeneous products with loads and loads of suppliers. We are dealing in an area where typically there'll be relatively few suppliers, and it's innovation competition that matters. And I think, therefore, that is what we should really be trying to protect. Okay, 2 more minutes. So look, I said there isn't an ecosystem theory of harm. I'm not sure it's terribly helpful to worry about exactly what an ecosystem is. I'm not a great labels man, and I think worrying about labels, exactly what an ecosystem is, can send you down blind alleys. What we need to do is we need to understand the basic facts of the market we're dealing with. So we need to understand what are the products, how do consumers use them, what are the firm's business models, how do they monetize, what's the role of data, what's the nature of competition, what are their particular capabilities that give them a competitive advantage. That's in the same way we've agonized about ability and incentive in vertical mergers. We're now thinking about capabilities. I think that's ability, but anyway, capabilities and incentives in these ecosystem types of merger. It's very important to understand all of those facts about the specific case. These, and of course, think about your capabilities. Do they have particular capabilities, the firms merging, that are important, unique, and hard to replicate? That seems to me to be a key test. When we do that, we then, as economists, I think, just have to think in a straight line. There's nothing very novel here conceptually in the economics. You look at Microsoft Activision, the cloud theory of harm, so I'm briefly mentioning it. There really is nothing novel conceptually about that theory of harm. It's really basic stuff. It's all about let's have an argument over the facts. Although, I said it's not controversial. All the competition authorities thought it was a problem. Okay. So I don't think the economics is sophisticated or novel. I think you really have to focus on how the markets work. I think this is an area, echoing something Cristina said, where economists have been really rubbish at understanding what drives innovation and disruptive innovation, and where the business schools have been much, much better. I'm looking forward to hearing from Joost and Michael, because I think there's a lot for us to learn. I think we're very slow to pick up on that. Christina's obviously trying to force us to do that. I think that's a really good thing. Okay, a couple more comments. In this world, we talk typically about dynamic competition, we talk about capabilities and incentives. We have a 50-50 standard. We can't just say, oh, it's really uncertain. I mean, Marx's comment, what do I need? I need a really reliable crystal ball. That would be lovely, but that's not the world we're in, and that is not an excuse to do nothing. You have to say, okay, it's 50-50 standard. That means if you're going to block a merger, you have to be more than 50% sure it's a bad merger. If you're going to clear a merger, you've got to be more than 50% it's a benign merger. You must ask yourself that question. You have to accept we're taking decisions under uncertainty. Okay? But that doesn't mean there's no evidence. You know, we can talk about internal documents. But one of the things that amazes me in this debate is people say, oh, you've got no evidence for your theories of harm. You know, I sort of think, well, hang about. I know the capabilities and I know their incentives. You know, people say, oh no, incentives aren't evidence. And I'm thinking, they most certainly are. If they're not evidence, what about upward pricing pressure or merger simulation, all based on incentives, which we've been using for years? So it's very important to think about the firm's incentives. We can only understand those if we understand the firms. I mean, I'd love to say a lot more, but I run out of time.
I think there will be a lot of discussion later. I think many interesting points here. I would say before giving the floor to Joost to provide a little bit as an invested, I would say, external observer to see a little bit the Microsoft Activision around cloud gaming. I mean, how do you see the concern in that case being articulated? But before giving the floor to Joost, just to say that this is obviously a concept that could possibly explain as well some interesting developments, legal developments like Article 19A of the German Competition Act. Of course, it's not about mergers, but it's about a little bit, not about a dominant position, a specific firm, but somehow the positioning of a firm in various different markets that because of certain reasons, the glue, as I was saying, talking before, might provide it power that could be of concern for competition analysis. And secondly, I mean, the issue about the 50-50%, is this a probability analysis or a relative plausibility analysis that we need to do, in the sense that we have two different stories, one to prove the merger, the other one not, for different narratives and different arguments, and somehow it's a choice between the two on the basis of some factors like how the one of the stories explains better than the other one, the facts of the case, how actually consistent the story is. So rather than a probability analysis, which supposes that we know what is 100% in order to define what is a 50%. Obviously, in these cases, we don't know. It's very uncertain. But anyway, the floor to Joost, and looking forward to hearing your views on this issue.
Thank you. So I will talk about the Activision merger. I wanted to give you an account of kind of how the CMA in evaluating this merger kind of evolved from focusing quite squarely on an ecosystem theory of harm to kind of moving to perhaps a bit more of a conventional input foreclosure argument. And to do that, it would help if we go back to kind of the early stages of the investigation when the CMA published its Phase 1 decision report in September 2020. And in this report, I would say the CMA outlined what I would call like 2.5 theories of harm. There was an input foreclosure theory of harm that would focus on console and multi-game subscription services. And then there was a multi-product ecosystem leverage theory of harm. So the input foreclosure theory of harm is quite simple, focusing on following the acquisition, Microsoft would potentially have incentive to withhold Activision games from its rivals in the console. So this would be Sony PlayStation, as well as multi-game subscription services. This would be PlayStation Plus, Nintendo Switch Online, and then a handful of smaller subscription services that mostly operate in the cloud. The argument focused both on full foreclosure, so withholding games outright, as well as partial foreclosure, so potentially withholding content and features, delaying the release of games on rival platforms, degrading technical quality and interoperability, and plainly raising prices on competing platforms. And in all of this, there was a really strong focus on Call of Duty as kind of the crown jewel in the Activision portfolio, if you will. And in making this argument, the CMA has harked back to one of Microsoft's prior acquisitions, namely that of ZeniMax, which is also a games publisher and developer. And following that acquisition, some of ZeniMax's games were taken exclusive, whereas others were released across multiple platforms. And so that begs the question, can we distinguish a type of game that is more likely to be taken exclusive following an acquisition versus those that are more likely to exist on multiple platforms. And so if you look at Microsoft's prior conduct and you squint a little bit at the data, a pattern starts to emerge where games that are based on established intellectual properties that are also strong multiplayer games, such as Call of Duty, those would be more likely to be kept on multiple platforms. Another example would be Minecraft. Whereas games that are based on new intellectual property that also strongly focus on single-player features, those would be more likely to be taken exclusive. And the argument there would be that Microsoft or any platform can focus its marketing efforts and grow the brand of those up-and-coming games. A recent example of that would be Starfield for the gamers in the room. Interestingly, in forming the argument, there's not really any prior evidence that Activision has released any of its new games day and date on multi-game subscription services or cloud gaming platforms. And there's also not really a lot of evidence that Activision would do so moving forward. And so Microsoft then argues that this would be a consumer benefit, making those games available on more platforms to more consumers at different price points. And so the CMA eventually focuses on foreclosure in the console space, but then later in an addendum published after the phase 2, the CMA concludes that there's not a lot of incentive to also foreclose in the console space. And so that brings us to the multi-product ecosystem theory of harm. And the concern there is that Microsoft could leverage Activision games to strengthen its own network effects, to raise entry barriers, and foreclose rivals in cloud gaming. And so Microsoft already has a strong multi-product ecosystem that consists of a gaming console, the Xbox, which it could use to promote its cloud offering, to cross-sell existing users to cloud gaming, and potentially to migrate its existing games library onto the cloud. The ecosystem also consists of a cloud infrastructure with Azure, and any cloud gaming service would need a strong infrastructure. But we should note that xCloud, Microsoft's cloud gaming platform, doesn't actually use Azure. xCloud runs on modified Xbox consoles, about 5,000 of them, that are spread across data centers in the UK. And then finally, the ecosystem consists of an operating system in the form of Windows. Many games and cloud gaming services already run on Windows. And Microsoft could use Windows to cross-sell users onto xCloud or Game Pass, although Microsoft's internal research, which is referenced by the CMA, shows that this approach has not been very successful in the past. So there's an argument that all of this would give Microsoft an unparalleled advantage in the nascent cloud gaming industry. And while this may be true up to this point, it's quite unclear exactly how Activision would add to all of this. Right? We should note that Microsoft already has a very strong position in games publishing and games development. It owns 24 game studios before this acquisition. And so we could argue that this acquisition would broaden Microsoft's capabilities in games publishing, but it would deepen its capabilities more broadly in the ecosystem. So then there's an argument that all of this might lead to import foreclosure, but obviously this is already covered in the first theory of harm. And then the CMA further argues that adding Activision games would give Microsoft leverage, which might result in denying cloud gaming rivals from accessing Azure or Windows. And in my own view, I think those arguments are a little bit far-fetched. I mean, Microsoft is in the business of selling Azure and Windows licenses. I would say that it's quite unlikely that they would discriminate between gaming and non-gaming clients or cloud or non-cloud clients. And so in the provisional findings, the CMA then doubles down on foreclosure in the cloud. There's still some language in the decision on Microsoft having a strong gaming ecosystem, but the cloud argument, if you will, is effectively dropped. And so in the end, these two theories of harms are kind of consolidated into one input foreclosure theory of harm on cloud gaming. And I guess if anything, at least in this specific case, I guess it signals that it can be quite difficult to bring an ecosystem theory of harm. And I'll pause there.
Well, thank you very much. In particular, this distinction between the two theories that became one at the end, and also your reference to the different elements of what will constitute the ecosystem of Microsoft, like a number of capabilities and assets you mentioned that could provide this advantage. as well as your language about broadening capabilities and deepening capabilities, which I think is quite interesting. Let's now move to a business studies perspective by one of the gurus of the field, one of the people that have been talking about ecosystems even before each of us have been thinking about ecosystems, Michael Jacobides. Michael, you've done a lot of work from business studies, but in recent years, probably through also our collaboration, you have been looking a little bit to the antitrust field.
Indeed.
So what would be your competition field? So what would be your insights there?
So as an outsider who's increasingly interested in this field, let me say that there's a bit of an excitement, because if you hear what Joost said, he basically says, well, we have a case that starts by saying, well, we're going to offer an ecosystem theory of harm, and then kind of backtracks because it may be a little bit hard to support it. The Bundeskartellamt also in its decision on Meta and customer had exactly the same thing. Actually, I think the Latham said, well, we do have some concerns, but we can't quite have the analytics to sort of articulate it. Whereas what I think is interesting is that, to me, the Booking.com etraveli is the first pure breed ecosystem based decision. And I think that if you take it epistemologically, it's a bit of a paradigm shift. We've been speaking about that. We know that the way in which we categorize the world does not cover the world, but it's not been terribly easy. There are subfields like IO that certainly says, well, we're not going to bother about that. That's not the way that we were trained. But in terms of the practice, there's a yes, but the problem is there. Let's perhaps think about how we can accommodate it. So for me, it's a bit of it's excitement. And of course, the question, as Marcus says, is, well, what on earth is it? Can you show it to me, and can you tell me what I'm going to do with it? Let me have two personal confessions here. The first confession is, when I started looking at ecosystems, I was as annoyed with the term as anyone in the regulatory community. The paper started as a, what on earth does this word mean? We've got all these interesting constructs, and they can cover us. And the more that I looked at it, I was like, blimey, there's something interesting there. And I think that the reason that it eventually took off, at least in our field, is that a canonical description of the non-generic complementarities gave rise to an understanding of the canonical problems, in the same way that in the birth of TCE, the nature of the canonical problem that this addressed gave rise to people saying, oh, okay, we can now start putting our hands around it, because we can say what is and what is not, and what kind of incentives lead to potential problems that these ecosystems inherently have. They resolve some problems, but they come with problems of their own, and we can start looking at their pathologies. The second personal confession is that I started looking at competition, which is what started the conversation with Ioannis, and the special issue of Industrial and Corporate Change in 2021 on competition and platforms, and regulating platforms and ecosystems, that I would encourage you to look at to give a sense of some of the key participants in this debate, was that there were significant issues of dominance. Now, if you think about them, I think that it is important to start getting the phenomenology right. And I will respectfully object to Sir Marcus bundling two very different things together, which are epistemologically incorrect to be bundled. Ecosystem is a structure, dynamics is an issue of time horizon. So both epistemologically and fundamentally, even though they may co-occur by people who are excited with both, we should not confuse them. And I don't think there is any sort of plausible argumentation of the two. Sure, we do want to think about dynamics. We have thought about dynamics in competition, and ecosystems pose specific dynamic issues. But the ecosystem is a question of phenomenology, and if I'm going to follow the tradition that Sir Marcus evoked with G.B. Richardson's lovely quote in Buttermilk and Coase, if you think, taking more of a Herb Simon idea of the Martian looking at the Earth, the Martian will not see therms, as Herb Simon suggested, and as you, Sir Marcus, also suggested. They will see some giant ecosystem orchestrators and a mass of complementers. Do I need to worry about them? I certainly do. Is it going to be harder? It is. Can I put my hand deeply in the sand, ignore them because it is harder to put my arms around them? We absolutely can, but I'm not entirely sure that this is a direction that is warranted in terms of our role in supporting competition the way competition occurs. So if you want to think about them, a couple of important distinctions. One of them, I admit, became clear to me as I was looking at competition issues, which is the distinction between multi-product and multi-actor ecosystems. So the two are entirely distinct, relate to distinct bodies of harm, and one of them is the fact that you have, in the theory of the firm sense, an orchestrator working with complementers to deliver particular products together, an orchestrator of the app ecosystem and the app developers. The other is the fact that people like consuming bundles, and here we go to what Mike mentioned, which is the nub of the problem in competition law, which is that sometimes what people consume is not necessarily the best thing for them, and there is a deep existential epistemological question of how far do we as regulators go. We regulate a number of things, from addiction to things that people don't understand are good for them. Where exactly do we stop there? In 2017, when Dick Thaler got his Nobel Prize, I really liked Dick's work. I opened Google and I looked at the two sites that Google had as the two top sites of Dick Thaler. There were two sites. The first one is that if a customer is given the default will become the overwhelming choice. And the second quote is that firms are choice architects. You put these two together, and I think that you understand what the problem is. And as you have seen, empirically speaking, all of you in your daily work, you will have seen that there is an expansion of ecosystems, and that is where I think the important issues of can we know, and I would heartily commend Mike for pushing us in this direction to think about what are the incentives. If we start looking at what are the incentives in ecosystem and how money is made, not in the market, which is this useless debate about the no cost markets, but the entire firm. There is somewhere that money accrues without tracking it, and with due apologies to my IO colleagues, they don't. On the whole, few exceptions. I know, Cristina, you've pushed for that, but it's certainly not the norm yet. We will not see where the problem is, and the CMA is a bit of an exception in helping push in this direction, and I commend it for its work there. A couple of final things. The first thing, if you want to think about the dynamics, people like my co-editor in ICC, David Teese and Nicolas Petit, say, why bother? It's all very dynamic. Apologies, but rubbish. If you look at the data, this is false. An interesting paper by my colleague Julian Birkinshaw was showing how the longevity not only of technology firms, but also of existing firms in terms of their dominance in sectors has entrenched over the last 2 decades. Do we have a problem, and do we under-enforce? Most probably, the answer is yes. Schumpeter was speaking in the beginning of his careers about these waves of competition, and the tech companies would have you believe that that is true. Well, the end of his career in 1945, he said, no, forget it. Innovation has been internalized in large firms. Neither of the two is true. Looking at a number of sectors with my Warden colleague, John Paul McDuffie, we realize that it's neither Mark I nor Mark II, it's Mark III, which is where big firms, not only in technology, use small firms that are await to be bought. Their entire existence is predicated in terms of being absorbed in order to continue their dominance, and the only other players who continue increasing their share in home markets and the other markets are big technology firms. Now, the issue there is that when you are happy in this multi-product ecosystem, the complementers of each multi-actor ecosystem are toast. Can you see in which ways they are toast? Yes. And when we had the hearings of the Klobuchar Committee, we could see specific ways in which this happens. So let me end by evoking the crystal ball paradox again. So Marcus, would you agree that we don't know where the climate science will tell us is the precise way in which the climate would evolve? I think that the answer would be yes. Does that mean that because we cannot precisely estimate how we are frying our planet, that we should take no action? I would venture to say no.
All right, thank you very much, Michael. You raised some interesting points. First, with regards, of course, to the role of complementers in the story, not just consumers. Somehow you alluded to exploitative concerns, not that exclusionary concerns that could be of issue. And I'm talking a little bit the competition language here. And of course, tendencies has been quite important in the way, we think about theories of harm. Is it something that the courts could accept, tendency as sufficient evidence of harm? It's an interesting question. I'd like now to move to Marco, shifting a little bit to the booking case, because, Michael mentioned to us that this is an interesting case for probably the first ecosystem case. I'm not sure, I don't know, what you think about that. So this is a very high profile prohibition by the European Commission. So could you tell us a little bit more about that and, the sketching a little bit the theories of harm, how it differs from classical foreclosure? The floor is yours. Thank you, Marco.
Thanks. So I guess everybody's familiar with Booking for good reason. They offer a great service. Everybody goes there to find their hotels. They're by far the most dominant online travel agency focusing on hotels in Europe. And they wanted to expand and buy a company that does flights very well. Maybe not the market leader, more number two, but great technology, very much liked in the market, and wanted to bring these together, the buzzword today, in an ecosystem. And so you could go to Booking, get your flight, get your hotel. They're expanding organically in a number of other services, the taxi, the restaurant, the activity. And so every time you wanted to go on a trip, you could do everything on Booking's platform. From a competition analysis perspective, what did this mean? That Booking will get more customers and get them early on in their purchasing process. I guess, as everybody experienced, you really want to get your flight before getting your accommodation. Otherwise, you risk going to you pay a hotel in Barcelona and never get there. And when I started working on this case, I thought, okay, let's try to understand. This point was echoed a bit from some of the speakers, how this market works. And I discovered some things I did not expect. Very strong network effects. Hotels want to be listed, surprise, surprise, on the website that have most customers. And people want to book hotels on the websites that have the most hotels, because otherwise you risk not finding what you want. And there's a lot of inertia in this market. I thought at the beginning, we all look around, shop, compare, Skyscanner, TripAdvisor, compare reviews. Most people do not do that. So they go to the place they know, the place they like, mostly Booking. And so what happens when you put all these ingredients together, you have a market position that becomes less contestable because Booking gets more customers, they get them early, they tend to stay in the platform they're used to. And so it becomes harder for an online travel agency to contest this position. This leads also to a strengthening of Booking's bargaining position. They can go to the hotel and say, hey, I'm the guy that has all the customers. So if you want to get customers, you have to come to me. And vice versa. You can go to customers. If you need a hotel, I have it. And I think this is the right moment maybe to share a personal experience. Last summer, I wanted to book a hotel. You could only book it directly through them or on Booking. No other online travel agency had them. But they don't have an online reservation system. So I send them an email, nobody answers. I call them 3 or 4 times, nobody answers. Against my better judgment, knowing everything I know, I'm Booking because I was getting a bit impatient. I get to the hotel and I learned that I paid about 30 euros more than I would have if I'd booked directly. And I think this really synthesizes the advantages and disadvantages of some of these platforms. I couldn't have booked it without Booking, but I ended up pay more. I could have also been more patient, but it's not one of my great qualities. And so what's new about the case? Is it really a new ecosystem? I see it a bit as a remix of some concepts that are very traditional in competition enforcement: dominant position, strengthening, entrenchment, increase in barriers to entry and expansion for competitors. Some elements of foreclosure. What I think, though, is quite different. In this case, first of all, the benefits to booking would have come from a weaker market. So you have, if you want to use the term leveraging, the weak market, the weak position into the strong. You usually look at it the other way around, the dominant position, and you leverage it to sell more in another market. And we abandoned or not rely in this case on the ability incentive effects framework. So we looked at it more as a structural change in the market that brings certain effects. You didn't hear me talk about conduct, of leveraging, of strategy, bundling, discounting, etc., etc. Just the way the market works would have led to a strengthening of Booking's dominant position thanks to this acquisition. Then I think the jury is out whether this is really new or it's more, let's say, bringing together old and tried elements to do something slightly different.
But may I just ask you, you know, in the Microsoft Activision case, you took a little bit of different perspective. You would like to comment on that in a sense? I mean, is it, you know, do you think that this ecosystemic perspective is something that, you know, you thought that the facts of the specific case in Booking Triveli was somehow different from the Microsoft Activision case? I mean, could you comment on that?
So I think from an investigative analysis perspective, there are very, very different cases. Microsoft Activision, we heard it before, more traditional. Ability, incentive, effects, some degree of foreclosure. And as I was just saying, in Booking, we went a different way. We have to move to some extent outside the Commission's guidelines and try to frame an analysis that made sense for this case based on the facts of the case to try to understand if there would be harm for hotel and consumers.
I think it's very interesting. It's a little bit about the idea that in the Booking Triveli was the glue that somehow, even not specific conduct or theories of possible conduct in the future, that what a behavioralist perspective on merger law would have taken in a way to build theories of harm, but it was more that the glue, the structural element that, as you mentioned, was significant. One might think could possibly do the same also in the Microsoft Activision, but interesting that was a different methodological choice. Excellent. So let's move a little bit to the legal discussion, because I think that's pretty important. I think, so Marcus alluded to that at the beginning. I mean, at the end of the story, I mean, it has to be, we have to apply legal standards. We have the courts to make decisions on the basis of rationality. And I would like to ask Daniel, I mean, you know, what would be the legal standard here? I mean, how can an agency deal with these nascent markets or early advantages when there's no market data to support a classic foreclosure analysis? And do you think these ecosystem theories of harm might offer some possibility and alternative here?
Thank you. Well, we've heard a lot of exciting, interesting, novel ideas from the economists and from those in business schools about how we think about these things. And therefore, it's a pleasure as a lawyer to turn up and be the very, very boring one. All the views I express are, of course, personal. I suppose I should say, as a barrister, I'm available to express any views in in due course. But let's start with the boring. Legal standards. It's really quite straightforward to express them. In the UK, it's for mergers. Is it more likely than not that there'll be a substantial lessening of competition? In Europe, there was a little bit of debate in the CKO2 cases, but is it more likely than not that there'll be a significant impediment to effective competition? Okay. Those tests are not differentiated by the types of mergers you're dealing with. The EC did go off on a little frolic in the General Court judgment in CKO2 where it said, oh, well, in these sort of conglomerate circumstances, it's actually a strong probability test that you should apply. And the upper court looked down upon the lower court and said, oh dear, no, that's not how we do things. It is a single standard of proof that must be applied here. And for those of you that are connoisseurs of the UK law on these matters, it's all about the same standard applying, whether you're trying to prove that there's an Alsatian in Regent's Park or a lioness you've seen in Regent's Park, an example given by Lord Hoffmann in a case called Riemann. The point is, you need less evidence to meet the threshold for proving you saw an Alsatian in Regent's Park than you do to prove you saw a lioness. Now, it's not because lionesses are inherently improbable in Regent's Park, because as we know, London Zoo's there, and there can be some safety issues from time to time. But nonetheless, you're going to need some pretty strong evidence to prove these things. So where does this basic approach fit when we start talking about ecosystems and other novel theories? Well, I confess I have a slight aversion to using that terminology for essentially the reasons that Mike has already articulated. It can blind us to actually thinking about the details, the facts, what is the glue, what are the collections of assets, how do they work? I'm not going to comment on the substance of cases because of my involvement in some of them, but if you just take the ecosystem that's talked about in relation to the Booking case, it's Booking's wide range of services that cover multiple facets of the travel experience. For instance, different types of accommodation, flights, taxis, car rental, tickets to attraction. That's the ecosystem. So when you see in a competition economist or administrator's diary an entry that says, engaging in an ecosystem exploitation opportunity, you understand they're going on holiday. Now, that is an indication of how you can overcomplicate these matters. And aside from this, because it's an exciting topic for policy reasons, for economic reasons, for business school analysis reasons, for practical reasons with companies, I do worry that we may be drifting into the concern that Cher, in that magnificent film Clueless from the 1990s, talked about, when admiring, it must be said, people, or not admiring them, described someone as a Monet. From far away it's okay, up close it's a big old mess. And the problem with a number of these theories is that on the facts, trying to get evidence of likely impacts, we do end up with a crystal ball problem. We end up with a particular crystal ball problem in dealing with these complicated situations. So is there a way in which an agency can deal with nascent markets and early advantages? The question you posed. Well, it may be that in fact it ends up having to clear a lot of mergers in those markets using the legal tests we've got, because going back to Mike's 50-50 test, it's really hard to show that it's more likely than not that there would be a substantial lessening of competition, there would be a significant impediment to effective competition. Particularly bear in mind there the S, proving the substance or significance of these things. It is extremely hard. You can come up with all these theories, but is it the S? And one last thought in relation to all of these games, the counterfactual. A beautiful, beautiful word for lawyers. No one really understands how it works, certainly in relation to merger control. But if you think about the circumstances we've seen in Illumina, Grail, we've seen in Microsoft, we've seen in Booking, what you have is a comparison between a bunch of agreements which might exist in the market and integration between the same companies that are engaging in those agreements. How do you assess that delta? Do you ignore those agreements? how do you grapple with that, and how does that feed into the S? That makes it even harder. I have total admiration for Mike and all that are dealing with these things, and Marco. It is not easy in the circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I mean, as Niels Bohr was saying, it's very difficult to make predictions, especially for the future. I think more or less you confirmed that. But I think, it's the point that Michael made before. I mean, there's a different issue, the phenomenological issue about what is an ecosystem, and then the innovation aspect, which I think is a different issue. I mean, of course, they have been related in these cases because the ecosystemic theories of harm have been used in order to make a point about innovation competition. But I think at the same time, we can probably distinguish these two questions as separate. Let me now give the floor to Christos to talk a little bit about the ecosystemic theories of harm. This was not really about always protecting competition in an asset market, but also about protecting one's ecosystem incumbency in a way. So the entrenchment, as some people said. So does it work? I mean, what are the limiting principles of that? What is the standard of proof in this context? Any ideas? Christos.
Thanks, Yanni. And let me disclose right off the bat that I was involved in the booking case as one of the as counsel to one of the parties in the European Commission investigation. So back to your question, Marco explained to us the theory of harm in booking, and there is no doubt he's being modest, but there's no doubt that this is the first prohibition decision based purely on ecosystem concerns. But the text of the decision is not public, so I don't think it makes sense to debate the ins and outs of the case. We can argue, of course, if this is really a genuine ecosystem at play here, or just a supermarket of holiday offerings. We can argue whether the Commission should have made an effort to spell out its novel ecosystem theory of harm in guidelines before implementing in the case. We can argue if Marco should have used Google Hotels when booking his hotel last summer, but I'm not going to do that because in the end, everything suggests that for the Commission, booking was not the end of the road. It was the first stop, it seems, and the same seems to be the case for other regulators. So it sounds like this kind of theories, and if we don't like the name ecosystem, we don't need to use it, but it sounds like they're here to stay, unless the courts tell us otherwise, of course, but I'm not going to get into that either. What I think is most useful to do is to look at past decisions of regulators and see if we can better define those theories. And by define, I'm trying to say, let's see if we can find limiting principles in the existing antitrust toolbox, a bit alluding to what Cristina said in the beginning, speaking to network economics and IO. So, and as you said, I'll focus on entrenchment theories, so theories where the concentration strengthens the acquirer's position in the core ecosystem market. So, I think we all agree that even the most hardcore enforcers agree it cannot be that every time a digital platform expands its product offering through an acquisition, this is a problem. So where are the boundaries? And first place to look could be at the nature, at the identity of the addition to the ecosystem. So we have the ecosystem, however we define it. What type of addition is going to really strengthen it? And we are talking to assets, to capabilities, but for me, how can we nuance the type of assets or capabilities which should be the ones that can be a problem or that cannot? And I have two questions in mind. The first one is, does the addition really affect the ecosystem directly or rather indirectly? So there are additions that directly improve the quality of the ecosystem, directly operate as a glue, as some of the participants said, and improve its appeal to its consumers. But there are also others where the link is I think, less certain. And I would put traffic into those. So there's no clear link between just driving traffic from one service to another with strengthening an ecosystem, especially if customers multi-home, although that's a question as to whether that is the case. And in fact, the Commission has accepted it in Apple Shazam that this kind of traffic cannot affect cannot strengthen the dominance, but then seem to go in a different direction in Booking. Second limiting principle is how easily can the competitors of the ecosystem obtain alternative capabilities or assets to those of the target. And there's nothing special here. I'm really talking about the must-have criterion for input for closure. But it is important to keep in mind that the addition has to be something unique. It has to be something scarce to justify merger control intervention. And we got it black and white in Google Photomath, where the Commission recently said the Photomath math equation solving capabilities are not unique, are not scarce. Bing has better proprietary capabilities. And in that sense, ultimately, the Commission cleared the merger and found that it didn't have any effect really on the general search Google ecosystem. Which brings me to the next limiting principle around barriers to entry and merger specificity. And so we heard from Marco from barriers to entry, which was a key element in the Commission's theory of harm. And the Commission also emphasized, as Marco did, that there were network effects in the hotel OTA market and customer inertia. But a limiting principle here could be, where did those barriers to entry stand before the concentration? So if they were already there before the concentration, and entry was unlikely already at the time, the issue is not the merger, it was the pre-merger situation. And there are tools other than merger control for that, but it is a question whether we should instrumentalize merger control to fix situations which are not merger specific. And that's another thing. You might think that's the only thing I've been reading the last days. It's not, but that's another thing the Commission said in Google Photomath. So that it cleared the transaction unconditionally because it thought exactly that the barriers to entry in that case pre-existed to the transaction. And vice versa, in Microsoft LinkedIn, the Commission clearly said, well, we think the market for professional social networks has network effects, but hasn't tipped yet. We are concerned that it might tip, and that is why we are intervening in this case. The third limiting principle I want to discuss is about ex-ante digital regulation, which we haven't discussed yet in this panel, like the DMA and other types of legislation that appear in different jurisdictions. And many of the ecosystem players merging are also subject to this kind of digital regulation. They're gatekeepers with the DMA, which limits the type of conduct they can take in the future and aims to ensure fairness and contestability in their markets. So the third limiting principle would be to focus on theories of harm with supposed future conduct would not be prohibited under ex-ante digital regulation. And again, nothing new here. This is exactly how the Commission has been dealing with GDPR until now. It becomes a bit trickier if we don't care about the mechanism that the combined entity will use to harm competition. But still, even sometimes it's the addition, it's the type of the addition, for example, data, that tells us what kind of conduct might be relevant and can give us a sign about whether that would be allowed or not under digital regulation. I had a couple of words on the standard of proof, but I feel like Daniel's Lioness example just covered it.
Right. Thank you very much, Christos. Very interesting points, and somehow also raising the issue. I mean, kind of a provocative question. I mean, this is like the ecosystemic theories of harm in EU law playing the role of incipiency doctrine under US merger law in a way, somehow covering this up in a way, that we are moving towards the incipiency doctrine in a cover way. Last but not least, of course, the issue of remedies, I think, which is quite important in these cases, but also could be quite interesting and complex in a way of dealing with ecosystemic theories of harm. And we have Jenine here who would like to share your views on this issue of remedies. Thank you.
Yeah, so remedies, remedies I think is an exciting area in many mergers, but I think in this sort of case, it's really where the theoretical rubber starts to hit something that's a very practical, very concrete sort of road. And the reason for that, if we step back and think about the individuals involved, typically sort of CEOs. Now, we talked about crystal balls, we talked about uncertainty. What happens with a lot of tech companies, particularly a lot of tech executives, is they are very comfortable and very used to making bets on technology. and making bets on how the future may emerge. And you get, in markets, very different views on what might happen. And you get not just different views, but very strong views. And that is incredibly important when it comes to both thinking through theories of harm, but also thinking through remedies. And I'll give you a sort of a concrete example that we faced in the Microsoft Activision case, was you had, first of all, the Activision CEO who had a very strong view that cloud gaming was not the way forward, definitely not the way forward for his games, and was not something that he saw sort of really developing. You then had a second view, which was the view of the Xbox CEO, that cloud gaming was not the future, but had a role, particularly on mobile, and a way of creating greater competition to deliver games to mobile phones, to take on the Google and Apple app stores on mobile. You then had a third view, which was not shared by either of the merging parties, but by some of the complainants, that actually cloud gaming might be a way of delivering games to PC. Now, this was not part of the thinking for the merger. It's not part of the merger rationale. This was not something that anyone had really sort of thought about. But when that theory of harm emerged, and you come to the parties and you say, this is what the regulator is thinking about, the question then arises, okay, we don't believe that, but what can we do to show that that is not what we're intending to do? This is effectively a collateral ancillary issue. We're very happy to try and address it. Now that raises a whole raft of different issues, many of which I think are really quite important in this area, because as an individual company with an emerging technology that you have no interest in trying to foreclose or harm in any way, one of the few things you can do is enter into contracts. You can try and demonstrate, you can make public statements, you can try and enter into contracts to supply the games to show that that is not your intention. And then the third thing you can do is offer remedies. And this is a very difficult space at the moment because, and I think this is fair, but agencies really struggle to take account of public statements. I guess the more controversial area is that they struggle to take account of contracts. And I think that is something that is very heavily debated, and rightly so. Then the third area is you get into remedies, and how do you design a remedies package that can actually be put in place and can be put in place for a long period of time. Now, we've talked about the fact that remedies have to address the theory of harm. Theories of harm really differ. They can differ between agencies on the same, on the same case, and Microsoft Activision was a case, an example of that. They can differ. Not the theory of harm may be the same. The facts may be seen sort of differently, and Booking etraveli was a case of that. And then you can see sort of shifts over time between different regulators, and the shift over time between, even in the short space of time between the decisions on Microsoft Activision and Booking etraveli on the Commission side are also sort of fairly stark there as well. And we also have a number of cases now where these theories of harm are developed in flight. And then we have quite a few cases where they change over time. Now, I'm definitely not critical of the CMA for this, but it is just really striking. Up until this year, I think we had 2 cases where the CMA changed the theories of harm after provisional findings, Deliveroo and Bauer Media. This year we've had 3. Now that's in many ways a really great example of the CMA taking account of evidence. There is a real question as to whether theories of harm, particularly novel theories of harm that create sort of novel issues on remedies, if they're changing at a late stage in an investigation, how do parties sort of deal with that? And then finally, I think there is sort of, and I guess with that sort of happening, there's also then sort of really interesting questions around procedure and what is due process in cases involving innovative theories of harm. To what extent should agencies be leaning in and trying to work with parties to try and find solutions when parties are indicating that they're open to that, when it's not the major part of the rationale for the transactions. And this is very difficult these days because we have very different institutional structures. So we have, the administrative system that the European Commission uses, which I think is often very proactive in terms of remedies. We have the quasi-judicial system that the UK has, where there are a number of sort of institutional restrictions. And then obviously we have the the out-and-out judicial system that we have in the US. And then we have some really quite significant differences in terms of actual sort of legal standards that are used now to try and measure, to try and decide whether remedies are appropriate in a case. So with the Commission, we have this concept of, obviously once you've found the SIEC, the merger needs to be, the remedy needs to be effective to address the SIEC. Whereas the CMA takes the more precautionary approach. We've got to make sure that the remedy addresses the SLC, but does not give rise to a distortion of competition. And we have seen cases, including in the Microsoft Activision case, where something that was discounted, something that was not more likely than not, was considered to be a potential distortion of competition and had to be remedied, even though it was not more likely than not to occur. And so with those different institutional frameworks, those different legal issues, I think we do now come to a point where we have comity challenges, let's put it that way, not just in terms of theories of harm and how you address them and evaluate evidence, but also in terms of remedy design. And those, I think, many companies are very keen to try and address those. I think, it becomes much harder as we move away from some very clear areas such as foreclosure, where it's a restriction of supply, and we move into some of the more novel areas like cross-selling opportunities and provision of data to exactly work out what those remedies might look like. But I think companies are willing to try and do that where they can.
Great. So that's excellent points. What I would like to do is maybe to give the floor for some questions or remarks from the audience, and then somehow end up by providing you a couple of minutes in case you want to respond to what you definitely do, I know. But let's give the opportunity also in case there are any points, very quick points, questions to be made by the audience. That's the opportunity now. You have to.
Let them think, and we can talk about.
Yeah, so I think so. So in case there are no questions, maybe let's move to Cristina in this case. Cristina, you have a lot of things to say. So
potentially,
any reactions to what has been mentioned so far? That will probably generate discussion.
I
Go
think
ahead.
everyone should have another go, and then of course the audience, if they have questions, but let them think. So I think we had a fascinating sort of journey through legal and economic. But going back to the beginning, what brings us here is this novel concept of ecosystem in antitrust. And I see a lot of stomach-churning discussions about what is an ecosystem, what could it possibly be. Look, or shut down this discussion on ecosystems. We better shut it down. Look, the thing exists, as Michael described, whether it is a multi-product firm or a multi-actor ecosystem, it's out there, it exists, it's a descriptive. No one is saying that an ecosystem is by definition bad. No one is making that point. It's just a description, it's a shortcut to say we have a particular configuration of asset capability, people, data, and various other things that somehow are sort of arranged in a network and work in a way that is related. So that is interesting because what's different is we're no longer postulating somebody is discounting, tying, or bundling. Please get this point. We had this discussion on conglomerate mergers where all the economists were up against and say, oh yeah, but what's your mechanism? What's your mechanism? What's the tying and bundling? What's the discount? We are no longer, the issue is there is no postulation of that mechanism. So the question then is, okay, so we're talking about assets that exist, and you are plonking into this constellation a new asset. Is that somehow the thing that makes the souffle rise, right? Is there more macro being created as a result? Because otherwise you can't just say, well, you've got stuff and that's a theory of harm, right? You've got stuff isn't a theory of harm. There needs to be a change brought by the merger in this constellation that generates some increased market power. And that's my real final point. I don't completely agree with Mike that this is somehow a place where the economics is easy and we all we know what we're doing. Because I don't think it's quite as easy, at least I think we're struggling, because that distinction between something which is somewhat benign or not damaging and something which can make that souffle rise is something that we haven't really articulated properly. And this is my real push to the community, to economists. Get on to decide what we're going to do, what kind of methodologies, what kind of analysis are we going to do, which sort of replaces the discussion we had for years before about what's the mechanism, is this a vertical arithmetic? Forget that. It's no longer that kind of foreclosure trick. So, and conclude, just to Marcus, yes, I understand that the crystal ball is worrying and concerns us all. But on the other hand, we're not starting from a clean slate. Here I reveal my colors. We have had years of merger after merger in which we've consolidated markets. I think this is common ground now. Only the most extreme people like David Tees think that innovation is going to save us all, but it is not quite the case. We have markets that are concentrated, and the prior is we should be more vigilant. So I agree that doing nothing isn't an option, even if with great uncertainty. I'll leave it there.
I think the souffle metaphor beats any definition of ecosystem that the business studies literature and economists will ever think about. It's an excellent definition of what an ecosystem is. And before giving the floor to Sir Marcus, just to say that when we have been negotiating the DMA, and I was actually part of the Greek negotiating team for DMA, we suggested with a number of other jurisdictions in the context of the definition of gatekeeper power in Article 3, Paragraph 8 now of the DMA to basically include the word ecosystem. And it was a very intense debate occurring. At the end, what they put is this Article 3, Paragraph 8F, which is, I just read it and somehow encapsulate what Cristina was saying before about the difficulty to imagine this. It actually reads, a conglomerate corporate structure or vertical integration of that undertaking, for instance, enabling that undertaking to cross-subsidize, to combine data from different sources or to leverage its position. So that was somehow the definition of what could have been probably an ecosystem in that context. I mean, I bet in the next revision of the DMA Act, maybe we'll see this term appearing, but I think the difference here is that DMA is very regulatory text, has very specific type of remedy. It's not the kind of case-by-case analysis that we have in competition policy, and therefore I think we have more freedom in the competition law field to use that concept and the concept of DMA. Sir Marcus, the floor is yours. A number of points were made before. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, it's funny, isn't it, how economists talk law and lawyers talk economics. So from Mike, we got the 50-50 burden of proof, and evidence is really, really important. Well, the burden of proof, the 50-50 case, is the marginal case. We ought to be whacking our decisions into the certainty one side or the other. We shouldn't be talking about the marginal case at all. Evidence is a very dangerous word. Whenever I hear the word evidence-based analysis, I know it's likely to be flawed because evidence is a legal concept, and in economics and in competition law, evidence is a very fluid concept, and we should be careful using that label. Of course, I am as guilty as any other lawyer of talking too much economics. You got co's and you got perfect competition from me, and I committed the somewhat unpardonable sin of equating dynamic competition with ecosystems. Well, let's be careful with labels. If I'm being taken to task for fundamentally misunderstanding these labels, then perhaps the labels aren't actually that useful. So moving on to the climate change example, which I have to say is, it seems to me, both unfair and misconceived. So I've got the word stupid written down here, but I won't say that. I'm not using the uncertainty and the absence of a reliable crystal ball as a reason for doing nothing. The one thing a court cannot do is do nothing. It has got to decide things, and that is what we are in the business of doing. Equally, the CMA faces challenges which I'm afraid the academic economists do not face, and it's this. Not only do they have to reach a clear answer, but they've also got to justify it, and they've got to justify it subject to legal scrutiny. So let's have a degree of sympathy for the work that both the CMA and the CAT have to do, in that we are dealing with situations which are not certain, clear-cut, like climate change. We are dealing with situations where a merger is being postulated, where we don't know what the answer is. If we did know what the answer is, it would be bloody easy to solve. That's the point. So we've got to ask ourselves, what is our process for resolving these uncertainties? How do we deal with matters? And I'm going to close with two suggestions, which are not terminologically complex. Let's start by working from analogy or model. I quite deliberately referenced perfect competition because we all know what it means. And if we use that as a touchstone, a measure for working out how far our given case differs from perfect competition and how far those differences matter, we will at least have a common language for assessing where things are going. And you will see, or will have seen, in various recent judgments, that we are relying rather more on analogies or models, including, in particular, perfect competition, in order to work out how the present case differs from perfect competition. Of course, I agree, perfect competition does not involve firms or mergers. By definition, it doesn't. But let us ask ourselves why it is that we have a case of an aggregation of market power, a concentration, which is not predicated by perfect competition. Let's look at the factors, work out what they are, and tell a story. And that is my second point. Let's not have too much maths. Let's not have too much modeling. Let us bear in mind that we are telling a story of human interaction. Ecosystems are about people. At the end of the day, we are looking at very complex interactions. And what we should be doing is we should be trying to explain in human terms why it is that the market that we're looking at is working in the way it is. And that way we can reliably extrapolate to what is going to happen in the future. So tell a story, make it coherent, make it internally coherent. And that way, I think we will achieve a degree of predictability. There is a full certainty in schedules of figures. There is a full certainty in saying that the econometrics predicts this. Let's draw a little bit more from the truth of the novelist. Let's look at that. I would only end with only two references to two of my favourite books. Let's try and make our decisions a little less like War and Peace and a little bit more like Pride and Prejudice. I mean, I love both, but let's have a bit of Austin over Austin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any comment, and someone that would like to, we have probably 1 minute each, I think, or a minute and a half. Any burning thoughts to be shared? Mike? Yeah.
Okay, I said I'm not going to respond to what we just heard. I do want to pick up something that Daniel said, which I think is really interesting, which is, I mean, Daniel made the point that he said that we may have to accept that we are going to have to clear lots of mergers, you know, in this sort of ecosystem type space because of they're all very uncertain. And look, and maybe that's the right thing. I just want to be clear that when we get to talk about this crystal ball, I don't think that we are trying to predict what the outcome of the market would be with the merger and without the market. I think lovely if we can do that, but a lot of the time I think what we're doing is what will be the process of competition with the merger and without the merger? Because the process of competition itself is of value. That is what leads to innovations and new products, firms competing against each other. So I don't think it's all about trying to understand or trying to pretend we can predict what the outcome will be. I think we can often say something about what the process of competition will be in both counterfactual and with the merger.
So if I may just respond, as I will stand corrected for my rhetorical excesses. Yes, Marcus, I did not mean by being deliberately a little bit cheeky to denote any lack of appreciation. As a matter of fact, I hope that I expressed my respect for CMA in particular, perhaps even more so than the continental counterparts, as they need case by case to investigate where the problem lies. And I think that I was in violent agreement with all that you said in the final comments, because I do think that one of the challenges is that, and that relates in particular to the use of economics, the lack of a clear answer is primarily a lack of math and models. We do not yet have an analytical arsenal that can give us the false presumption of certainty, which was one way or the other arbitrary, even in cases that did not have the complexities of ecosystems, because we feel somewhat more comfortable if we have something that is a definitive number, which of course comes with as many asterisks if you really look into it carefully. In terms of the ecosystems, the reason that I'm a little bit more optimistic, call it what you want, and I don't have any particular concern with whether we use a terminology or not, is understanding incentive structures and behaviors and then seeing, are they moving in the right direction or not? And there is empirical research, and we have seen how some of the big tech firms have evolved them. So are there standards that we can bear and debate in a process in a court of law? Probably. I haven't been involved in order to be able to have a full assessment. But if the courts accept that there is full certainty in numbers and are able to take some things that are strong qualitative suggestions that things are moving in the right or in the wrong direction, I think that that will facilitate a slightly more grown-up conversation about what that is. But I may be wrong, because I have not seen the vagaries of the court cases.
Daniel?
2 quick points. First of all, I'd like to make it clear that Sir Marcus's comment that its storytelling in relation to cases was not driven by his membership of the Lawyers' Union, as I understand it. It is nonetheless an important point that you do need both the story overall, but also I think we do need to recognise the importance of data analysis if we can have it, because there is a terrible danger that our stories become anecdotal. Lawyers are beautifully brilliant at finding particular documents from particular people and painting a picture. And it can be massively misleading. The forensic process is not necessarily good at dealing with these things. And when I say the forensic process, I do actually mean both before the regulators and indeed before the tribunal. Indeed, the irony of our system in the UK is because you're only at judicial review level, actually getting into the facts can be quite hard, but that's a debate for another day. The courts have recognised, and I think it was Lord Hoffman again, who said we need to be careful of a spurious degree of precision being found from data, but that data can still be critically important in acting as an antidote to anecdotes.
Yeah.
Excellent. Any further thoughts from the audience? Sorry, yes, Marco?
Yeah. No, I like an economic debate like any lawyer. I just want to point out, I mean, what I tell my teams when we work on internal documents, bear in mind is like reading somebody's diary. You know, they may know themselves very well and describe themselves and what's happening to them very precisely, or they may think that a passing glance is a sign of true love. You have to really take it with a pinch of salt. But that being said, I think it is important, and apologies for using the term fact-based that I tried to avoid so far, but to do a fact-based analysis, because when you're talking about these novel theories or these new ways of looking at the true and tried economic processes, you're also looking at a business reality. If you take your phone, you'll have either one system or the other system. If you take your laptop, the same thing. If you want to plan your trip, you're probably going to certain service providers, and examples can be brought about this. And I'm not here to say if regulators have been asleep or not, but there is a reality in the economic world where companies try to become stronger by adding bits and pieces. And of course, the challenge, as has been raised by several speakers, is to understand what is material and what is not material. When you're looking at a small addition that will have no impact on the process of competition, on competitors, on the dominant firm, and where there's something that has the potential to be significant, but the only path I see to get there is to work on the facts and the evidence and market dynamics and people behavior. You have to bring all of this together.
Excellent. Yes, Jenine and then Joost.
Yeah, look, so as someone who also spends a lot of time reading internal documents, I guess I wanted to just sort of make the following comment, which is a lot of times the documents are written in order to encourage people to invest in a particular project. And those documents are then written with a very significant degree of, optimism bias. While business school professors, I think, are part of the solution potentially here, they're also part of the problem. Okay. So, and what I see increasingly now is everyone has a flywheel. Everyone's flywheel is going to fly. Everyone's going to have, the most brilliant network effects, direct, indirect, all the rest of it. It's all going to be just wonderful, and they are going to sort of dominate. Well, they don't use the word dominate because we've taught them not to. But the flywheel is definitely going to fly, and it's all going to be peachy. Most flywheels don't fly. Again, to bring in an analogy from development economics, we have these things called O-rings. If they fail, your big spacecraft falls out down to Earth or explodes or whatever. There can be a whole bunch of reasons why a flywheel will not fly. And it's really important to try and sort of understand those. We are probably the least entrepreneurial bunch of people who are sitting in judgment on people that take bets and are willing to fail. And many of the cases that we're looking at, many of the cases that I've had the pleasure of spending a lot of time on to develop, remedies, unfortunately, those particular mergers have failed. And I'm thinking here of, even Facebook Customer. Customer has already been sold off by Facebook because that was not a flywheel that flew. So let's, I think just a degree of humility is, for all of us, is incredibly important.
Thank you. Joost?
Yeah, I will not talk about flywheels. So I wanted to riff off a little bit of what Mike was saying, that there is no one ecosystem theory of harm, and then kind of what Michael was saying, that we need to distinguish between multi-product and multi-actor ecosystems. And so my thinking on this is developing, but I think we have to distinguish between these different type of ecosystems and the related theories of harm. But if we think about a multi-product ecosystem theory of harm, we think about how does an acquisition strengthen or expand a focal firm's position in related markets? How does it potentially harm consumers in related markets that either the acquirer or the target is active in? And so I think this would very much revolve around internal dynamics, kind of looking at what are the synergies, what are the mix of capabilities that make the merged entity stronger. And it would look at the related markets as being somewhat separate or independent. And from where I stand, and I'm not an expert on the legal theory, but this seems to largely overlap with conglomerate theories of harm or portfolio effects that Cristina was also mentioning. Whereas when we talk about multi-actor ecosystem theories of harm, we look at how does an acquisition or a particular conduct affect the interdependencies between actors that are active in what would be referred to as a platform ecosystem. You know, does the conduct raise prices for participants? Does it shift value from one party to the other? Does lock-in mechanisms increase? So how does the conduct potentially harm complementers and consumers that are using the same ecosystem? And so this would very much focus on the external dynamics. The platform ecosystem is the market here, and any sub-markets would be interrelated. I think it's really important that regulators keep bringing these arguments, but I also think it's important that these arguments can be adequately scrutinized, given how novel these theories are and often how dynamic and forward-looking the arguments are. I'll pause there.
Well, thank you very much, Joost. I think we'd like to thank all the speakers for their excellent comments and discussions. I think I've been a little bit wiser after this session than I was before that, and I hope that is for everyone here. Let me say that we have a Chatham House rules that apply, and I thank very much also the speakers that disclose their associations and involvement in cases. So thank you very much, and please join me in thanking the speakers formally for this excellent performance.